This discussion on the isms, as I call them, is going to be incredibly brief. We'll discuss a little bit about some concrete events, but for the most part, we're discussing ideology. So, although it's exciting, try to stay calm. First, we come to conservatism. Okay, so there's these, during the 19th century, we see a lot of ideologies that are starting to crop up, and they begin to govern the way people live and the decisions that people are making. Okay, so conservatism. Conservatism was the belief that tradition should rule the way of life. However life was traditionally governed, politically, socially, economically, that was the way life should be. Conservative proponents seemed to hold to ideas that refuted the Enlightenment, desired order and hierarchy to everything. So, for example, only the elite should rule. 19th century conservatives would have argued for a state church. The middle class, the bourgeoisie, they are the enemy. Individualism, this is bad because it can produce anarchy, a state of disorder, right? Because of the absence or the non-recognition of authority. So, so this is sort of like the very opposite of Enlightenment ideals, right? That's the idea of a 19th century conservative, and try to push aside your notion of a 20th or 21st century conservative or liberal. They're not the same thing. These are two different things, right? So next is liberalism. 19th century liberalism seems to hold the highest Enlightenment ideals, fighting especially to change the traditional way of life. Liberals did not want monarchs, aristocrats, or clergy to dominate their governments. They saw power within these groups as limiting individual liberty. So we can already see some very big differences between the two. Liberalism appealed largely to the middle class. So where the middle class are the enemy with 19th century conservatives, they are the heroes, sort of as it were, of 19th century liberals. Liberalism advocated limited governments with written constitutions. So we would say that the United States, after the Revolution, this is a country full of liberals in the 19th century sense, right? They did not pursue equality among all. Okay, so they're not advocating women's rights. They're not advocating the rights of the poor. They're not advocating the rights of men without property. And not all of them, some of them, but not all of them are advocating for equality between different ethnic backgrounds. From liberal economic ideas comes a very famous book, The Wealth of Nations. That's the shortened version of the title, written by Adam Smith from Scotland. In it, he explained the concept of supply and demand, as well as the laissez-faire policy, although he didn't call it that, which ultimately limits government involvement in the economy. The term laissez-faire is a French term which means let them be, or it can be loosely translated as let it alone. Again, he never actually used this phrase, but his ideas of limited government involvement in the economy is most clearly represented by using this term. Smith argued that economies had their own natural laws, that the economics had its own natural laws, and that if you just left it alone, for the most part, that it would take care of itself. Very much a proponent of what we refer to as capitalism. Now we come to nationalism. Sometimes I refer to nationalism as patriotism on steroids, right? This is not simply being a patriot, proud of one's country. This is an idea of superiority. Nationalism is defined as a sentiment based on common cultural characteristics that binds a population and often produces a policy of national independence or separatism. Now, this idea has been around since ancient times. Many historians tend to give credit to the French Revolution for its more modern form. We see nationalism being explained as the motivation behind the unification of nations. freeing countries from foreign rules, creating community, leading people to common destiny, so on and so forth. At nationalism core was a feeling of cultural identity among people with common language and common traditions. Across Europe, several countries took up nationalism. Many of these countries developed groups and secret societies composed of students, intellectuals, middle-class members, which promoted the idea of national identity and national unity. Before 1848, nationalists seemed to work with liberals, sort of best, as it were, due to the idea that sovereignty should rest with the people. However, later on, nationalists would work more closely with conservatives because both believed traditions were important and community was more important than the individual. And again, nationalism gives rise to ideas of superiority. So probably the most famous nationalists would be the Nazis during World War II. Socialism was the belief that society should not be in any sort of hierarchy. Socialists taught that the workers were missing out on all of the power and the wealth of the Industrial Revolution. So they called for a reordering of society that would eliminate competition and class divisions. This sounds great, doesn't it? I mean, everybody working together. There's no more competition. There's no more huge gap between rich and poor because there are no rich and there are no poor. But this is an illusion of hope. And as we will see as we continue down studying in Civ 2, we will see that this is simply not the best political structure or economic structure because it simply does not pay attention to the nature of man, which is sinfulness, always looking out for oneself. Now, socialists found enemies in both liberals and conservatives. There were some who were called utopian socialists that said all property should be owned communally, individualistic competition should be completely done away with. Like this was, this is the ideal perfect society. Not everybody thought that way, but some did. Within socialism came the rise of what was first called scientific socialism, and we know it as communism. Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto with Friedrich Engels, 1848. He wanted to abolish capitalism altogether. Marx's theories about society, economics, and politics, sort of collectively known as Marxism, hold that all societies progress through the dialectic of class struggle, a conflict between an ownership class which controls production and a lower class which produces the labor for goods. He was heavily critical of capitalism. He called it the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, believing it to be run by the wealthy classes purely for their own benefit. He predicted that, like previous socioeconomic systems, that it would inevitably produce internal tensions which would lead to its self-destruction, and then a replacement by a new system, and that system would be socialism. Marx argued that under socialism, society would be governed by the working class, in which, and what he called the dictatorship of the proletariat, or the workers' state, or the workers' democracy. He believed that socialism would, in its turn, eventually be replaced by a stateless, classless society called communism. Along with believing in the inevitability of socialism and communism, Marx actively fought for socialism's implementation, arguing that both social theorists and underprivileged people should carry out organized revolutionary action to topple capitalism and bring about socioeconomic change. So let's translate that. Karl Marx said, since it's inevitable that capitalism will fall, we should go ahead and make it happen. There should be people rising up in revolution, toppling their governments and establishing a socialist government, and that eventually it would evolve into a society where there is no state and there is no class, that everyone is on the same playing field. Now, again, this, in some ways, it sounds like, you know what, that wouldn't be too bad. And it wouldn't. In fact, I mean, in Christ, all of us stand equal before God. I am no more superior than, than the poor person who accepted Christ in a dumpster. There's no way that I can in any way call myself superior or inferior to anyone, because it is Christ which gives me worth, not myself. That stated, we live in a sinful, broken, fallen world, and these ideas sound great, but if we don't take into consideration the nature of man, we will go by way of basically every communist state to this point. I've also seen communism firsthand. I lived overseas for a while. It's not pretty. You can come by and visit sometime and I'll tell you about it. But anyway. Okay, so we've got all of these new ideologies hanging about. So what sort of comes from these? In 1815, Parliament did not include many members outside of a few families. Property qualifications only allowed about 5% of British adult males to vote. Industrial cities were barely represented, and a depression hit, so people wanted change. In 1822, Britain left the concert of Europe. They did attempt some reforms, but nothing that offered more popular participation in government, which is what a lot of the people were really clamoring for. So in 1832, Parliament passed the Reform Bill, which did not accomplish all that the people called for, but it did help some. Property qualifications were lowered, so more men were able to vote. Electoral districts were rezoned, offering more power to larger industrial cities and taking away the power from rural areas. Now, in 1807, British abolished its slave trade. In 1833, okay, so nearly 30 years later, it abolished slavery in the British colonies. So the slave trade was abolished before slavery itself was abolished. And France followed suit in 1848. To help alleviate some of the problems within the industrial sector, Parliament outlawed the employment of women and children in underground mines. They also prohibited the employment of children under the age of 9 in textile mills, and they limited children age 9 or older and women to working only 10 hours a day in those factories. Again, part of these reforms meant to help the working class people. Although instituting several positive reforms, the British government did not always act. In 1845, a strange fungus attacked the Irish potato crop, and most of the rural and poor relied on this crop. So when it failed, several years in a row, we see over 1 million people dying from starvation, and around about 1 million others left Ireland to find a better life somewhere else. Britain's government ultimately decided to do nothing to help. In 1846 to 47, there were bad harvests, famine, inflation over food prices, an economic downturn, bringing less demand for manufactured goods, businesses failing, workers losing their jobs. I mean, this is kind of a crappy situation. This is, think the Great Depression, right, of the 1930s. This is a bad, bad place to be in. So people start to organize themselves into anti-government groups, seeking to relieve some of the problems. Several countries suffered from revolutions, but we see it starting basically in France. The constitutional monarchy under Louis Philippe was a regime of wealthy property owners. By 1847, almost half of Paris's workforce was unemployed. People from all ideologies began to rise up in protest and in seeking support for a more democratic government. The U.S. served as a symbol of democracy to the French during this time, so much so that a group held a banquet in honor of George Washington's birthday. The government attempted to stop the event from happening, and when they did, a crowd grew in the streets, and a fight started, and of course, someone fired a shot, because that's what happens, right? Troops guarding the government houses began to fire into the crowds, and the people started open rebellion, and another revolution began. When the National Guard joined the rebels, the king went into exile. A group of liberals proclaimed the Second Republic, drew up a new constitution, and they also called for universal male suffrage. But they also implemented a plan that was doomed to failure. To increase employment, the government created projects, like public works projects, but there were more workers than there were jobs. Those who could not get work on these projects were still paid. That's a bad idea, right? This began to drain the government, but they started increasing taxes, which ultimately scared everyone. So in April 1848, elections were held, and conservative Republicans and monarchists took office once again. So the revolution did establish a republic, but it nearly failed. Other countries, Austria, Hungary, Prussia, Germany, and Italy, all withstood revolutions as well during this time. Germany, which was still a dismembered grouping of individual states, became unified as a nation. Italy started down that road as well. So next time, with the next lecture, we will begin discussing nationalism, state building, and also we will discuss 19th century reform efforts in great detail.